Hi, welcome back to my Formative Assessment podcast. And this is the 9th podcast, and this one is building on the work we did last time on curriculum and moving to assessment. And for the cover screen, I wanted to reflect my own journey on assessment. So I've actually titled this podcast, Improving Learning in Grades, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Assessment. And I'm here inspired by Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, and there is Peter Sellers as the infamous doctor, the kind of mechanical, creepy guy. For some reason, those ideas are melded in my head. That I used to think assessment was just a really unnecessary and external bad thing to education. And what I've come to see is actually assessment is as crucial a portion of pedagogy and curriculum. And that's really been a huge change in my thinking, I'd say, in the last 2 or 3 years. And I want to help take you on that journey and show you a little bit about what I mean by assessment and why I've come to to that thinking. So I'd like to begin by just noting, I was really, as I've said in an earlier podcast, it was formative assessment, particularly that of Shirley Clark, that really helped me understand what I was doing in the classroom, to turn all the theory into practice. But I really never noticed the word assessment in formative assessment. And, Dylan William has made some comments about wishing he and Paul Black had named it something else. But it's worth noting that it is there, that actually this pedagogy assessment is central to it. As a starter, you can pause, you can write down, you can think, to what extent were you like the old me? We don't need assessment to know our students are learning. Assessment demoralizes students. Assessment is about sifting students into worthy or unworthy, and assessment distorts the project of education. To what extent were you like the old me? These things may be true to some extent, but that doesn't mean that assessment is the problem. Because what we have to think about is it's an absolute reality that students don't always learn what we teach them. So how are we going to know what it is that they learn and don't learn? Does that matter? Does that matter to you? Absolutely, it can demoralize. If your culture of learning is built on comparison, grades, ranking, and a fixed mindset, very much assessment can become a means to demoralize students. If we allow externalities to determine what assessment is, what we get is a sense of what society values in tension to what we ourselves value. And that's something I think we should think about in terms of assessment. If, in fact, as we talked about in earlier podcasts via Paulo Freire, if the project of education is to empower or enable students to think for themselves, teachers need to help motivate and interest students. We need to give them the sense that they have a belief in their own capacities to improve and change the world. And if you put it like that, actually assessment is a crucial tool for determining where the student is and what we need to do to help them achieve their next step. And that really is at the center of the pedagogy. So assessment itself can't be the problem. Maybe it's the way assessment is conducted, or the way we understand assessment, or the way that many of us only use the exam itself as the assessment. That might be the problem. Let's move to some of the things Dylan William has to say on this. He says, assessment should be designed to support the curriculum in place in a school, rather than having the curriculum designed to fit the assessment system. And I think we should just even pause there. That's a really important phrase, that how much the exam system hijacks our curriculum and hijacks the way we think about assessment. Assessment actually has a job to do. It provides information for the following stakeholders: students, parents, and teachers, as well as leaders, about the progress of students in their learning. The tension, again, comes down to something we talked about in an earlier podcast about data versus decision. So is data driving our decisions, or are we creating the mechanics where we decide what we want to know, And in that way, we design assessment to generate data. So that's the difference between data-driven decision-making and decision-driven data collection, which is a really interesting division. If you go with the latter, assessment's really important. Now, it's become, some of Dylan Williams' tweets then just become, people just hijack them, and I don't think that's quite fair. I think we should go with what he's written. Recently he said he wishes he didn't call it the word assessment in it, and a book by Henry Taylor Fletcher Wood, I think his name is, looks at, he wants to recall it responsive teaching. And the problem with responsive teaching, I would say, is too much of the emphasis there is on the teacher's role. And actually what we've looked at in these podcasts is the way that the teacher organizes the learning, creates the learning environment, creates the lesson and the curriculum, but it's the student that's actually doing, and we assess to see where the student is. So what we've done is we've looked at metacognition, talk culture, learning intentions and success criteria, the notion of excellence, questioning, feedback, the structure of a lesson, of a unit of work and a scheme of work, and the larger structure of the curriculum, all as a way of saying that assessment is something that runs throughout that circuit to see, okay, are students actually learning, and how are teachers responding to that? So I'm still firmly of the belief that once I woke up to the word assessment being in formative assessment, actually it's a much better phrase and idea that we take into our minds. So I'm just playing around with the structure of the lesson and showing you what we're going to look at today is why do we assess, when do we assess, and what do we assess, and how do we assess? Okay, so let's go back to Dylan Williams' idea of assessment cycles. We looked at this for curriculum. There's long, medium, and short. And we have the span, the length, and the impact. So long is across units in long spaces of time and for curriculum alignment. Medium is the unit, and then short is the responsiveness. So short could be seen as what we've been talking about within the lesson. We want talk culture where we're constantly assessing and engaging diagnostic questions and hinge questions, crucial moments where the teacher can respond and change and adapt. We know what long term is because that's like something like the mock cycle, or in fact the summative testing cycle. But if we're going to do mocks, what we need to do is do them very rarely, because we need to have enough time, because it's a longer scope. Once we've assessed it and once we've given feedback, students need to act in order to improve for the next time. So it's really important that long circuits are separated. And of course, medium is where, at the end of the unit, where we look at what did students learn, and how did they learn? And thinking about, just like in the lesson, we use talk and quizzes and multiple choice questions and all sorts of different apparatus for checking. Maybe we might start to think about in the mediums and maybe even the long, different assessment apparatus for figuring out what are students actually learning. Let's remind ourselves what formative assessment is, where the learner's going, where they are now, and how do they get there. We know that we can make that clearer using learning intentions. We get evidence of learning, feedback, getting students to collaborate with one another, and then getting students to be owners of their own learning. But ultimately, what all of this amounts to, and you have to take this really carefully, we've talked about this before, but it's worth going over 100 million times, is really all that's at stake here is using evidence of achievement to adapt what happens to classroom needs. If that's what formative assessment is, we note that assessment is crucial for that process. So we need to assess to figure out where students are and how to adapt, so that we become so that we're not simply just delivering or lecturing in the hopes that things will stick into kids' heads and then blame them for not. What we should be doing is using assessment as a way of checking and adapting. Paul Black says something similar in his book. I thought this was a really interesting and great book, actually, Testing, Friend or Foe, Theory and Practice of Assessment and Testing. You know, Paul Black was the person that worked with Dylan Wiliam on the original Assessment for Learning work in the late 90s. This was another book where he looks really deeply into assessment, formative assessment being one part of that. And, you know, why there are three principal reasons to assess. Okay, so the formative is for him the main one, which is a way of aiding learning. You assess, which is what we've talked about up until this point. Summative is at the end of the unit to review, transfer, and certify. So we can think about the end of the GCSEs or the end of the A-level. We could think of a driver's test, for example. You have some kind of end test that determines a common language for what you've done. And another reason we assess, he says, is public accountability. And that is, you know, we have to address that what's happening is schools are judged based on how well or poorly their students do. And he says, you know, that always that requires contextualization, and it can be really misleading because tests aren't necessarily designed. Well, I mean, it's worth thinking about what is a test designed for and what are results designed for? And are these tests actually designed for measuring school progress? So the last one is something that we're all a victim to or part of this system, but it really needs to be taken carefully. I would argue, in fact, the third one is why a lot of us are kind of annoyed or pull away from assessment. And what we need to do is pull it back to become something meaningful. Because the problem is with public accountability, if assessment becomes the key way that we measure school accountability, a game begins. And I'm going to introduce you to two concepts. One's Cambell's law. I got this from David Koretz. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. And this is also said in another more succinct way, maybe with Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. I think it's important to look at, I mean, I have found it quite stimulating to look at, I mean, I can't believe this, assessment theory, data theory, because it makes complete sense that once we start judging things based on tests or measures, those measures become distorted. We become fixated on improving the measure, not the actual phenomenon it is meant to measure. And here, this idea is really crucial because what's happened is we've shifted from, and we talked about this in the curriculum podcast, we've shifted from an idea of looking at what the learning is into shifting to look at the the improvement of results. And once we improve results, someone like Daniel Koretz would argue, these two laws indicate it, then that is no longer, it gives the illusion of improvement, not necessarily true improvement. And you know, further, he's very funny because he quotes Linda Darling Hamilton. This idea that there's this thing that teachers know what to do, they're just not doing it, they're not stimulating doing it, and this is the kick the dog harder model of education reform, that you continue to strike and brutalize schools to the point, to force them to improve. And I would say that Ofsted and the academization system and the league tables in England are all these systems that have, where teachers and schools are expected to make up for all of society's ills. That has distorted what our idea, what assessment could be. So, I mean, I've talked about him before. I really recommend this book, The Testing Charade. This goes back to something we talked about in the curriculum podcast about teaching your subject versus raising the score in your subject. Okay, and we got to think about that carefully. And what assessment can be for, and what it is being distorted into. So he gives us an example of reallocation is one of the problems with distorting assessment in schools. And he gives the example of VW. And he says, okay, look, diesel engines, they function and they can be measured. Idling, decelerating, maintaining speed, accelerating lightly or strongly. There are all these different ways you can measure how a diesel engine works. And for emissions tests, just based on cost efficiency, there's only one test, and that is when the car is not moving. So what Volkswagen did was they created a cheating software for good emissions figures under one type of test. And this is a really good example of reallocation, where Volkswagen looked at one type of test and tried to enhance it, and improve the measure. But notice, please, that they improved the measure, not improving the underlying process the measure was intended to track, which is the efficiency of the actual engine in a number of circumstances. So you see this gaming, this reallocation, this concept, okay? Listen, anyone listening to this, never get in your mind that I am not in a school where the pressure and of getting good results isn't a reality, where and the pleasures of getting good results and chasing results and improving and wanting the best for our children and wanting that narrative to be true and justifying actions that are immoral and unethical. All of those things are part of what it means to be in a school in a high pressured situation. And we do have to reclaim assessment, and we have to be honest about what it is. What are the problems about what we're doing as well? So what is reallocation? Well, there are two types of reallocation he talks about. And this is really crucial coming off of the previous conversation of curriculum. The main reallocation problem, he says, is between subjects. So, of course, literacy and numeracy from primary school up to secondary school. You can add the triumvirate of science as well. They become the centerpiece of the curriculum. And not only that, because there are only a certain number of hours in a day, this comes at the expense of the arts, principally, but broader subjects overall, because, and we have examples of students losing PE, lunch, break time, all over the country, all over the world, to get more time to do English and math, because the measurement of those particular subjects are of higher value. So what we get is a reallocation of time. And then within the subject, we get a reallocation where we narrow, we have, again, remember, we have the curriculum, and then we narrow to the very small domain knowledge of the test, teaching to the test, because that's what is ultimately tested. Now, the solutions are not easy, but we've talked about them. We need a solid, broad, and balanced curriculum provision. We need teachers that are constantly developing their subject knowledge and developing their curriculum. And most importantly, and why I'm making all these videos ultimately, is to understand that pedagogy is the driver for all improvement. Now, it's not enough to just reject what's on the left, because this is the reality and kind of the amazing pleasure of being in the world, that we have to struggle with the pressures coming at us, and we can't simply say no, or no is not enough, as Naomi Klein says about the Trump regime in America. I mean, we have to offer an alternative, and the alternative is about developing our curriculum, about making ourselves better teachers and making ourselves a better school, and that is our responsibility. If we're going to make a genuine curriculum, an assessment that is meaningful and not simply the game. So there is an ethics of assessment. He quotes a kind of amazing Kentucky, a kind of regional school commissioner in Kentucky, who Koretz finds just utterly remarkable. And there is an ethic that comes out of assessment, actually, because our job is ultimately to serve students. We have an ethical obligation to learn whether they're learning or not, and whether our policies are working or not. And if there are problems, we need to change course. authentic assessment can gauge teaching and curriculum. It is a form of feedback. Now, it's so interesting how all of these things kind of meta above the classroom practice into a kind of theory practice. But of course, it is feedback. Assessment is feedback to teachers, to departments, and to leaders. And part of our professional identity should be the centrality of wanting to grow as teachers. And in that growth, to help our students as well. I've always been wary in the 10 years I've been in this profession of anyone who I'm immediately suspect of any leader who starts talking to me about the needs of the student above anything else. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe in that, as I've written here. However, I think it's an interaction. I don't think you say you don't use the student's needs as an argument to batter through a teacher, to berate them, to put them down, and to force them to do anything, because it's a really convenient kind of idea. I'm not going that way, incidentally. What I am saying is we seize back assessment, and we see it as an ethic, as something that's part of what we do, and to think about it and to understand it as much as we think about pedagogy and curriculum, and to think about it as a tool that can improve us, a tool for feedback. So we are seizing back assessment as part of our professional identity, because we can't let the exam be our curriculum. We can't let external bodies determine our own professional standards and work. We can't let exam performance be the only measure of student success or our own success. And we can't pretend that improving results will necessarily lead to greater social and income equity, which is kind of, I'd say, a kind of unstated part of the rhetoric and discourse of increased results, is that presumably with higher results will come a reduction in inequity. And then this isn't always stated outright. Sometimes it is. And that's an illusion. That is a lie. That is an outright lie. And we need to be able to say something that's more robust and professional than that, because that isn't what we're here to do. I mean, if it is what we're here to do, then we have to have a bigger political conversation, because what I know that we have power over it is curriculum development. And from leaders all the way down, we want to have a broad, rigorous curriculum. And that involves teachers improving subject knowledge and their ability to design and curriculum. We definitely need to not only know more about our subject, but how to teach our subject and how to teach. Pedagogy has to be a huge thing that all teachers at all time work on to improve. And thirdly, we all need to develop an assessment literacy. And it's a concept I'm kind of unfortunate wording, but I'm going to stand by it. This literacy means multiple tools for effectively measuring, articulating, and celebrating student learning, and to learn about where they are and to adapt what we're doing to respond to that. And so assessment then becomes a means to enrich the lives of ourselves and our students, and it's a professional identity for self-respect and attempting to build a better society. And there's my critical pedagogy, that actually, once we seize back assessment as a tool, not just exams, Ofsted, etc., externalities, but it's actually something that we do linked to our curriculum, we can build an idea, a notion of what it means to be a teacher, what it means to be a school, to help actually build in our students the means for building a better society. And I actually would stand by that as a larger goal. I can't make that my central goal. Like, I can't just start with the blue. And I can't just say no to the red. For me, what's in green is essential for how I'm going to achieve, to improve myself, the people around me, the community I'm in, and ultimately student learning. Okay, so let's look at what this notion of assessment literacy. This is Rick Stiggins. This is a book I got at the beginning of the lockdown because I was very saddened and annoyed by a lot of the language and discourse around how the Ofqual and the English, the British government was going to accommodate that there were no exams. And I really wanted to understand who might have other ways. And I was just drawn to this title, and I know the author. He's very interested, of course, in formative assessment in America, and he's very angry. This is an angry book about how here's a guy who's like kind of loves assessment and hates how assessment has been hijacked. And he says, okay, look, a good assessment, all assessments have to have clear purposes, clear learning targets, high quality exercises. They need to be able to communicate effectively and link to the dynamics of student motivation. That ultimately here we have growth mindset and the idea of pushing kids to learn, because those are the things for him assessment should be about. And if assessments are going to serve all users, it has to answer when we examine or put pressure on what happens after the assessment, we have to ask ourselves, what decision is going to be made based on the assessment? Who's going to make the decision? So is the decision the teacher? Is the decision the student, the teacher, the manager, the leader, the systems leader? Who, like, so for example, once an assessment has an outcome like determining your set, for example, that assessment starts to take on a different kind of intensity. Or I mean, we're going to talk about validity in a second, but who makes the decision about what happens on the test is worth thinking about. And what information do we need to make a good decision? Now, again, we go back to Dylan Williams' idea: is does the data drive that conversation, or has decision-driven data collection driven that decision? So you see that when we get to grips with what is strong assessment, we can make better decisions that we have actually some control over. Now, I read this book earlier on this year, again, because I'm just interested in the topic. And these scholars are looking at university. And, university is a lot further behind, I would say, than what we're doing in high schools, particularly in England, about what does it mean to assess. And a big problem is that how these university lecturers who are they're researchers who are now being invited to create assessments. In England now that we have tuition fees, students' ability to assess and understand how assessment is working is a real problem, and it isn't quite clear, and it's becoming a thing of tension. I had a teacher here in the UK who said something to me, this was in university, and she said, prior to tuition fees, they wouldn't really respond to emails. Or when a student asked a question like, how do I improve? She would want to say, just be cleverer. And I remember thinking that is a completely unreasonable and inadequate response. And, she was lamenting now that with tuition fees, you have to think through and, that's the job of a teacher. Well, I think she exemplifies the fact that both the idea of being cleverer is not helpful. The teacher doesn't know, the student doesn't know what is it that we're actually talking about. So these scholars have started to think about, okay, assessment literacy, and they use the notion of literacy and apply it to this concept. So assessment literacy means knowing the combination of knowledge, skills, and competencies that you want to test. They use the idea of literacy, so the words and the grammar. So the words, the basic principles, the grammar, the technical approaches to assessment, and a really deep appreciation of the purpose and processes of assessment to enable deep engagement with the standards of your subject and facilitating choice about what to assess, how, and why. So it's not just from on high, but it obliges kind of scholars and to think about how does their assessment work and how do their students know about it? Are their students literate in understanding how they're being assessed? Now, you got to be careful. I should say assessment literacy is not teaching to the test. It's understanding how you're being assessed. And that is a crucial distinction. And you got to think about in university how they just don't, they're not, as my teacher said, just be cleverer. it is much better for both the student and the teacher to understand how assessment works, how their curriculum works, and it leads to better learning. This is a kind of matrices in their book that I found really interesting. So in the past, it was traditional laissez-faire, which was exemplified by that story I told, where it's like, okay, just write an essay and we'll assess it. So it's kind of a wandering, that's very, there's a lot of like being in the know that's being tested, and who knows and who doesn't know how to do well that's a really deeply unfair model. That's in the bottom right-hand quadrant, and we're moving to a more, explicitly sharing the assessment objectives kind of example. And what the book argues is a more advanced one, or hopeful. And again, you always need to have a progression. You always need to think about the future. Social constructivist approach where students and communities of practice kind of determine and delineate assessment. And I think that's an interesting place even for us to think about, moving away from the external exams being the only measurement of our version of assessment, is to think about how do we as communities develop our own assessment practices. And then, of course, they've got this very advanced, hopeful notion of the cultivated community of practice approach, where assessment is an informal, constant practice, where it goes even further in this kind of, even further in the student and teacher co-constructing what it is that assessment is supposed to be, and doesn't need to always be in a kind of formal way. I mean, that the top right-hand quadrant is really advanced and not really quite what I understand right now. I think that the third quadrant is something that I think we could think about approaching and moving, because definitely in schools where we are is in the second, which is definitely wasn't when I started. It was more laissez-faire. Now, assessment objectives, making clear what you're being assessed on, yes, but can we move from strictly that delineation into a wider spectrum of not just teaching to the tests and the AOs, but to the curriculum, and to understand different methods of assessment? To do this, here's another document by Dylan William that I'm going to send along. To do this, we're going to need to understand how assessment works. And the second aspect of assessment literacy are these two crucial concepts of validity and reliability. And the first main idea, and so I've had to learn a lot about this. Now I feel like, for those people who understand this more than me, please forgive me, correct me. I think these ideas are important, by the way. That's why I'm doing them. I understand they're difficult. They're difficult for me too. I'm trying to simplify them. If we're going to become assessment literate, we need to understand what these are. Okay, so there are two main concepts in assessment literacy: validity and reliability. And the first thing you need to understand is no test is valid or reliable. It is the judgments that we make based on the test that we can say to a larger or lesser degree are valid or reliable. Okay, so that's the most important thing, that everything is about judgment, not about the test itself. No test in and of itself can be valid or reliable. That is a definitional error. So when we talk about validity, what we are worried about are tests so tests are samples, as we know. If a test undersamples, the validity of what we can say about the test is in jeopardy. So we have to sample, but what are we going to sample? Okay, so like maybe, and by the way, I should say this too, so we could assess everything they learn, but that's going to take a lot of time. So we need to, in the interest of time, we have to sample, but what do we sample? So that's a problem. Sometimes a test can underrepresent what it is that we've tested, and that jeopardizes the validity based on the so if a test only samples a very narrow portion of the entire curriculum, and from that we determine whether students have learned or not learned, that the validity of that judgment is in jeopardy because it's such a narrow underrepresentation. Further, for validity is the idea that there are things that we're testing that are irrelevant to what it is that we want to find out. So the example that Dylan Williams gives is a math test with a lot of reading. So we may want to find out about a student's computational conceptions or algebraic conceptions, but in order to do that, the test will have an enormous amount of reading and translation of the reading into mathematical thinking. What happens is there's a lot of construct irrelevant material that is interfering with our ability to make valid judgments on the mathematical understanding of those students. So these concepts are really crucial. I'm going to start with validity. I'll roll back to reliability in a second. They're really important for understanding the curriculum and also, the curriculum and also our own understanding of how we can design tests. And I'm going to give you an example from Dylan Williams. So here's an example of construct irrelevance variance. Okay, so let's say you had two history teachers or two departments, and one felt that testing could be done, like all the testing could be done by multiple choice. Okay, and the other teacher disagreed completely and said, okay, testing could be solely done with constructed response questions, essays, in other words. What this becomes actually isn't a debate necessarily about assessment, but it's about the construct of history itself, back to the curriculum and what we were talking about in the last podcast, and how the assessment actually reflects differing ideas about what history is about. So assessment is melded into a conception of the curriculum itself. I'm going to go to Dylan Williams. I'm going to read explicitly. So to those who think that history is about facts and dates, selected response tests of historical knowledge are efficient, and for them, writing essays would be construct irrelevant. On the other hand, those who think that history is more than knowing facts, but also about constructing historical arguments, they'd regard multiple choice questions as underrepresenting the construct of history. I think this is an interesting tension point, because what I've really moved to, and I presented this to you in the questioning podcast, is the idea that it could be both. Different assessments can be used in different moments for different things. But what I want you to think about deeply, or not deeply, you can go away and read about it, I'm still puzzling over this, is from what we imagine the curriculum is, what kinds of ways can we come up with assessments that are construct relevant, that are valid? Okay, and one way I think to resolve the issue in front of you here right now is to think about both assessments being used at different moments for different reasons. So facts being used as one form of measurement and the essay being used as another form of measurement, and maybe being used at different moments. But crucial, of course, is this idea of curriculum. Okay, what is it we're trying to do in our subject? What is a test where we can judge whether we've done it or not? And what is a valid conclusion to be made based on that assessment? Reliability, this other concept, is the idea that if the test was marked by someone else, it would have the same result. There is nothing outside of the test. There are no variables outside of the test that are affecting our ability to judge the conclusions we're making based on it. Okay, so for me, reliability is about working together to understand what we're seeing. And Dylan Williams actually says reliability is a subset of validity, which I thought was clever, but I'm not going to go into that. You can read his document if you want. So validity is, does this assessment actually measure what we want to measure? Reliability are the results that we're getting not dependent on other factors. Okay, so the marker doesn't know how to mark. The test was interrupted by a drill. Some students wrote in the hall, some wrote in the classroom, and there were things on the walls that might have given them indications of the right answer. I mean, there's all sorts of things that can affect the reliability of a test, but and we could get really technical. I'm not that technical about it. I think there are a few things that are takeaways here. If we think about reliability as being important, what we can think about is moderation. That particularly in essay-based subjects, that teachers come together to have a shared understanding of markers, monuments, endpoints, excellence. We understand what that is, and we test and regulate and moderate that moment to improve our reliability. Another thing that we'd want to do is, in the example that we gave about the history test, the multiple choice test is going to give us a clear sense of reliability because answers are right or wrong in that sense, dates, facts. But so that's good, because if we narrow things, we get a certain type of reliability as well. So maybe we could distinguish between kind of knowledge-based factual tests and essay tests that require more moderation and more development of reliability. Okay, so these two concepts are the second pillar of understanding what assessment literacy is, because we are going to try and seize back assessment as a way that we can improve our own pedagogy. So one idea that I'm presenting to you now is, like I said last podcast, the exam can no longer be the thing that determines our curriculum. And you'll notice that Ofsted has swallowed that hook, line, and sinker, right? After years of just pushing the exam, now they're going to talk about curriculum. So false, so unfair, so silly and childish to not acknowledge how much they've distorted the system already. But nonetheless, let's ourselves go larger and take a more. Let's go beyond Ofsted, shall we? For we are not determined by these people alone. If we're going to take back assessment, let's check on our curriculum. Are there multiple ways that we can do that? And I'd say yes, absolutely. There's knowledge. We should test knowledge. We could test application. That would be in my subject, I don't know, but unseen tasks, increasing complexity, group and solo work, being able to see that. We could have excellence. You know, Dylan Williams gives a model in this document that I'm going to send around on assessment. It's quite provocative, of a teacher who only gives 1 mark for a certain project, and it's an A. And it sounds, you know, on first shot, you're like, well, that's dumb. No one's going to try. And it was like, well, no, you have to keep resubmitting until you get an A. And I thought that's really amazing. That reminds me of Ron Berger and what we talked about in terms of excellence. And the idea that students have to redraft and meet the standard, and they have portfolio. Look, portfolio assessment is highly unreliable, because different schools and different teachers and different places assess the portfolio in different ways. But that doesn't mean portfolios can not be yet another type of assessment we use, especially if we think about excellence and students being obligated to redo things until they meet an expected standard. That's something. And finally, performance. Let's not forget, excellence could be artifacts, projects. I'm thinking about art, DT in particular. Performance, I'm not just thinking about the performative arts, by the way. I'm thinking about physical education, but I'm also thinking about all subjects, actually. That activities, performances, audio, film, something that students have to do. Why can't that also be a form of assessment? Then that if we had this broad rainbow of different assessments, teachers would have a variety of different decision-driven data points to determine what skills and what processes students are learning that aren't solely the exam. And if we build assessment as a crucial part of our curriculum, we can really push on to something more advanced. And again, I've mentioned this book a few times. It's probably one of the most challenging books I've read in education in the past years. I go back to it constantly because there's so much there. And it's really challenged my thinking, and I think it'll challenge your thinking. This is the last chapter. And it's her integrated assessment system. And she says, okay, look, you have your curriculum, your schemes of work, your lesson plan, and you have a progression model, this idea of how things improve. So what is an integrated assessment model going to look like? Well, for your entire curriculum, you need to have formative items. Okay, you need to define those as part of your curriculum. And that's going to be key concepts linked to curriculum. You can think about diagnostic questions, hinge questions. They should be something that departments spend time developing and thinking about to aid in the delivery and achievement of the curriculum. It will help teachers out. It will help teams out to figure out, okay, in lessons, are students actually meeting what they're trying to meet? Then there are two summative task models. One is the difficulty model, and that you can think about increasing difficult questions, and that would be like the maths GCSE. And what schemes of work could start to do is develop their own kind of bank of these tests at different levels, and you get that progression model. And then what you have in more essay-based subjects or performance-based subjects or art-based subjects is a quality model. So that's the idea of excellence, progression. That's an essay or performance. We have different models, student examples of strong work, of exemplar work. So students know what they're aiming at. So teachers know what students are aiming at. So leaders and faculties understand where we're aiming. And so if you look at this really carefully, what we start to see is when we take back assessment and we start to integrate assessment back into the curriculum, what we have here is a really powerful model of multiple forms of assessment to give multiple pieces of information to the teacher, to give them multiple moments of adaptation to understand what the students know and don't know, and to help facilitate their professional choices in response to what the students know and don't know. And that essentially is what this is all about. Why do we talk about pedagogy, curriculum, and assessment? These are the pillars of our professional identity, and they should be thought about, and reappraised, seized back by teachers to feel that we can do something that isn't solely being judged by the exam and external bodies. Okay, so what we've looked at is why we assess. We've looked at different cycles of when we assess, and what we have to leave with. And look, this has been a lot of work for me because I'm right at the edge of my thinking here, which is what and how do we assess, and how are we going to integrate and develop our own assessment tools, and a diversity of tools to make assessment more effective. So I'm just going to leave you with some actions, and I really want you to think about it. Assessment literacy is not about teaching to the test. It's about understanding what assessment is, how it works, and what it does. And this is going to be, assessment is about improving and adapting our curriculum articulation. It's going to be about staff really starting to understand how assessment works and what kind of tests we can develop. To develop different modes of short, medium, and long tests. And we're going to think about how much time assessment takes up, which is not something I could talk about today. But if you notice, kind of mock exams take up an enormous amount of curriculum time. And we're going to need to think about how does that work, and are there alternatives? Because there is a sacrifice between assessment and curriculum. There is a balance, and you have to treat that balance carefully. That assessment and our own assessments need to be mapped onto the curriculum carefully. Not about teaching to the test, but again, using assessment as a way of seeing how achieved the curriculum is. We should think about Daisy Christodoulou's really provocative notion. No, I don't think it's that provocative, actually. It's just really clear. This integrated assessment system. I would really like us to think about multiple and creative ways to check on student learning, because I want assessment to be something meaningful, not just something, rudimentary. I think everything leads back to what you do in the classroom. So a formative pedagogy, a dialogic check and response system within your daily teaching is going to help you to understand the importance and a means for making assessment a more vivid and helpful concept. And then we need to develop student assessment literacy as well, just like they need to in university. to help with metacognition and student self-regulation. So where this leads us is there's a tension in assessment, and we need to balance the needs of senior managers who use summative data and are interested in summative data to make certain kind of decisions and evaluations, and teachers who are more interested in formative, kind of where the kids are at and how can I adapt to that. So what we need to look at is how do teachers and leaders improve learning and attainment, and that's something we're going to look at in the next podcast, which is taking some of these ideas of formative assessment and taking it to leaders. So I hope what I've done to you again is got you to think about assessment and to stop worrying about it. Of course, you should always worry. I mean, should not worry about it. But if we could stop worrying about it and learn to love it and take it back, we could do something really impressive with assessment. I hope that you're all doing well. I hope that I've helped you see some of these issues. And I hope you all go watch Dr. Strangelove, because it's an absolutely amazing movie. And I hope you have a good week. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.